When we think about monsters, our minds usually jump straight to creatures from the movies, right? But what if I told you that one of the biggest nightmares in US history didn't have sharp fangs or terrifying claws, but instead a completely ordinary face, one you might pass by in the grocery store without even blinking? Gary Ridgway, the infamous Green River Killer, shocked the world with a brutal series of murders that still leaves law enforcement and experts in psychopathy puzzled to this day. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the disturbed mind of this serial killer and explore how a traumatic childhood filled with abuse and domestic violence paved the way for such barbaric crimes. You'll uncover chilling details like necrophilia and the twisted tactics he used to lure his victims, many of them helpless teenagers and prostitutes, working the streets of Seattle and King County. Get ready for an intense criminal investigation packed with unexpected twists and turns, where forensic DNA polygraph tests and mysterious disappearances come together in a puzzle that took nearly 20 years to solve. And the question that still haunts us is, how did Gary Ridgway manage to stay free for so long, hiding so many crimes right under the noses of US authorities? Stick with me until the end, because I promise, what you're about to hear isn't just the story of a serial killer. It's a deep dive into the darkest corners of human evil, with details that not everyone has the courage to reveal. When we talk about Gary Ridgway, the notorious Green River Killer, it's hard to imagine that such an ordinary face could hide so much monstrosity. Born in 1949 in the state of Utah, USA, he grew up in a household that seemed to have more problems than solutions. In a home marked by domestic violence and child abuse, young Gary was already showing signs that something wasn't right. It was as if life itself had started shaping a future serial killer before anyone even realized it. And what happened next would make the entire country shudder. Gary wasn't raised in anything close to a fairy tale home, far from it. Daily exposure to shouting, fights, and physical violence shaped a dark and resentful personality. While other kids dreamed of becoming astronauts or firefighters, Gary was growing up fueled by emotions that would later explode into brutal murders. Deep down, we know, toxic environments leave deep scars. Ridgway is a chilling example of what can happen when childhood turns into a factory of trauma. Over the years, the crimes Gary Ridgway committed became a full-blown national nightmare. Newspapers splashed shocking headlines: missing prostitutes, teenagers vanishing mysteriously around Seattle and King County. It was as if a ghost was haunting the streets, leaving a trail of pain and mystery. No one knew exactly who was behind these disappearances, but the fear was real. There was this heavy, silent terror in the air, the kind that makes you double-check your locks at night. What's even more chilling is that Gary Ridgway always seemed one step ahead of the criminal investigation. While bodies were being found along the banks of the Green River, he was living his life just like any other ordinary citizen, working, getting married, raising children, all while a psychopathic mind lurked silently underneath. With each new body discovered, the mystery only grew, and so did the certainty that authorities were dealing with one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Gary Ridgway's childhood was like an emotional minefield. He grew up being verbally abused by his mother, who never missed an opportunity to insult and humiliate him in public. To make matters worse, his father was known for physical assaults, creating a home ruled by fear and domestic violence. It's not hard to see how this level of child abuse planted deeply twisted seeds in Gary's mind. The wounds, invisible to the eye, became deep scars on his soul. One of the most telling aspects of Gary's childhood was his struggle with bedwetting, something that persisted well into his teenage years. And guess what? Instead of offering support, his mother made sure to publicly shame and humiliate him, widening the emotional gap between them. It's at this point that many experts in psychopathy raise the red flag. Constant humiliation during emotional development can trigger serious behavioral disorders. And with Gary, that's exactly what happened. Gary's relationship with his mother was loaded with conflicting emotions. At the same time he feared and hated her, he also felt a disturbing attraction toward her. This emotional confusion opened some very dark doors in his mind, giving space to horrifying fantasies involving necrophilia and violence. It's no exaggeration to say that Ridgway's traumatic childhood was the fuel that ultimately transformed an ordinary boy into one of America's most brutal serial killers. The line between love and hate had never been so thin. And it wasn't just at home where Gary faced problems. At school, he was described as a withdrawn teenager who struggled academically and had major issues socializing. It was clear early on that the combination of child abuse, domestic violence, and social isolation was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. His childhood is living proof of how untreated trauma can morph into something terrifyingly lethal. From a very young age, Gary Ridgway was showing signs that something was seriously wrong inside him. While other kids were playing hide-and-seek or dreaming of becoming superheroes, Gary was fascinated by death. It's shocking to think that, as a teenager, he attempted his first murder, attacking a 6-year-old boy. The attempt wasn't successful, but it clearly showed that the future Green River Killer was already pushing the boundaries of violence. What few people know is that this early attempt was almost completely forgotten by authorities at the time. With no serious legal consequences, Gary was free to keep nurturing his dark fantasies, many of which involved disturbing elements of necrophilia. While his peers were thinking about graduation and their first jobs, Ridgway was sinking deeper and deeper into his twisted thoughts. It was as if fate was waving him forward, and he didn't think twice before following its call. And here's the most chilling detail: the pleasure Gary felt just thinking about dominating, killing and abusing already lifeless bodies. These morbid impulses started intensifying in his late teens, turning him into a perfect breeding ground for even more violent behaviors. Forensic psychologists warn that when fascinations like necrophilia show up so early, it's a massive red flag flashing in every direction. In Gary Ridgway's case, that warning was ignored, with tragic consequences. Yet even with all these screaming signs, Gary Ridgway continued living what seemed, from the outside, like a completely normal life. And honestly, that's a trait many serial killers share: the almost chameleon-like ability to blend into the crowd. And time kept ticking. While Gary's twisted mind was gearing up to take even darker steps into the world of serial murder, the monster was already awake. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike. As an adult, Gary Ridgway seemed to have found some direction. He enlisted in the military and was sent to serve in Vietnam. But instead of straightening out his disturbed mind, military life seemed to sharpen his darker side even more. After his service, he returned to the US, trying to build a normal life. He got married twice, had a son, and for all appearances looked like just another ordinary citizen. But the truth was, the monster inside him was simply hibernating, biding its time. It was during this period that Gary started visiting prostitutes regularly, using their services as a way to vent his frustrations and bottled-up desires. At the same time, he dove headfirst into a deep religious obsession, attending church services and trying somehow to balance his perverse urges with a public image of faith. A dangerous combination, right? On one side, fanatical religiosity; on the other, a deep-seated rage against women. The result? An inevitable escalation towards serial murder. Gary developed a visceral hatred toward prostitutes, teenagers, and vulnerable women, seeing them as easy targets for his thirst for violence. Instead of confronting his own inner demons, he projected his frustration onto them, carefully plotting his attacks. And here's the most disturbing part. He believed he was cleansing the streets, as if his crimes had some twisted moral purpose. This bizarre distortion of reality is common in cases of psychopathy, where killers see themselves as vigilantes. And so, without raising suspicion, Gary Ridgway began his path as the dreaded Green River Killer. In the early 1980s, his first crimes started popping up in the Seattle area and throughout King County. Prostitutes were disappearing mysteriously, leaving no trace behind, while Gary would come home, hug his son, and act like nothing had happened. It was a double life straight out of a nightmare, and sadly, it was just getting started. Gary Ridgway was a true master of manipulation when it came to luring his victims. He understood that in the harsh world of the streets, prostitutes and vulnerable teenagers needed to trust someone to survive, and that's where he played his ace. He carried around toys and pictures of his young son to project the image of a harmless family man. Who would suspect a proud father showing off photos of his child? It was a cold, calculated trap. This strategy worked like a charm, especially in the early 80s, when trust was still a currency among the street workers of Seattle and King County. The victims accepted rides, felt safe, and that's exactly when the Green River Killer would strike. Gary used quick, efficient methods, usually strangulation, leaving few visible marks. Then he would commit acts of necrophilia, completing his sadistic cycle. Here's another macabre detail. Ridgway developed tactics to throw police off his trail and complicate the criminal investigation. Many times, he would dump bodies in remote areas, hiding them in dense vegetation, or tossing them into the Green River itself. And knowing that forensic DNA was starting to become a powerful tool, he took steps to minimize evidence. But even so, small mistakes were left behind, and they would prove crucial years later. The most horrifying part of it all was the coldness with which Gary Ridgway treated his victims. To him, they were disposable, mere objects to fulfill his twisted fantasies. He didn't kill out of survival or self-defense. He killed for sick pleasure, the product of a deeply rooted psychopathy. Each new disappearance only boosted his confidence and his feeling of being untouchable. But as we know, time would eventually catch up with him. For years, the King County Police worked tirelessly, piecing together clues, trying to find the person behind so many disappearances and serial murders. But believe it or not, Gary Ridgway was so skilled at covering his tracks that he kept slipping through their fingers. Even when he was interrogated and subjected to a polygraph test, which he passed successfully, investigators were left with nothing solid to hold him. It was like chasing a ghost through the dark streets of Seattle. Ridgway was even arrested a few times for minor offenses, but there was never enough hard evidence linking him directly to the murders. While police struggled to assemble the puzzle, he continued committing crimes without raising any serious suspicions. However, with advances in technology, forensic DNA testing started gaining ground. Samples preserved from crime scenes could finally be used to unmask the criminal who had terrorized the region for so long. It wasn't until 2001, nearly 2 decades after his first murders, that everything finally fell apart. Using more advanced DNA testing, investigators were able to directly link Gary Ridgway to several of the Green River Killer's victims. His final arrest happened almost anticlimactically, just an ordinary man being handcuffed without resistance, as if he already knew his time had run out. It was a moment families devastated by loss had been waiting for years. And here's the brutal irony. After years of disappearances, false confessions from other suspects, and criminal investigations that led nowhere, it was science that finally brought justice. Forensic DNA, the very thing Gary had tried so hard to avoid, ended up sealing his fate. The man who once fooled a polygraph couldn't fool biology. Gary Ridgway's arrest marked one of the most iconic moments in U.S. criminal history, but the horror of his crimes would continue to haunt us forever. After being arrested, Gary Ridgway didn't hold out for long. In fact, he ended up striking a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he would confess to as many murders as he could remember. And what came to light was even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Ridgway's confessions revealed the darkest side of psychopathy. He spoke about the murders with the same emotion someone might use to comment on the weather: cold, calculated, completely devoid of remorse. During the interrogations, Gary cooperated by pointing out the locations where he had left the bodies of many victims who were still missing. This became the prosecution's trump card, the possibility of finally giving some closure to families who had spent years mourning without answers, without even a body to grieve. With each new discovery, more layers of horror were peeled back. Prostitutes, teenagers, women who vanished without a trace, all victims of a sick, silent mind operating in the shadows of society. In 2003, the final sentence came down. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, stacking up to 480 years behind bars, a punishment that honestly still felt small compared to the devastation he caused. His crimes shocked not only the United States, but the entire world, and his trial turned into a full-blown media spectacle. It was like watching a horror movie unfold in real life. Families weeping, prosecutors outraged, and an emotionless killer staring blankly into the cameras. Even after his sentencing, Ridgway kept surprising everyone. In later interviews, he admitted that even he didn't know the exact number of lives he had taken. His initial confession of 48 murders was just the tip of the iceberg. Which leads us to wonder, how many stories of pain are forever buried, never to be found? Gary Ridgway went down in history as one of the worst serial killers the world has ever seen, but also as a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes evil wears the most ordinary face. When Gary Ridgway initially confessed to 48 murders, it already sounded like an unbelievable number, right? But as time went on, he let slip during interviews that the actual total could be much higher, possibly reaching 71 victims, maybe even more. Just imagine, Dozens of lives stolen, families shattered, dreams cut short. And the worst part? Most of these women were prostitutes and teenagers, people who back then didn't get the attention they deserved from law enforcement. A mistake that cost dearly. This gap in the victim count shows just how meticulously Ridgway planned his killing spree. He chose targets he knew would be less searched for, less investigated. Sadly, many of the disappearances weren't even officially tied to him, simply because there was no solid evidence, or no bodies were ever found. The Green River Killer exploited the flaws in society to his advantage, cold, strategic, and cruel, right down to his last breath. At times, Gary even seemed proud of what he had done, describing the murders with an eerie calmness. To him, each death was just another number, another statistic lost in the chaos of so many disappearances. And that's where his psychopathy became most brutally clear. The complete absence of empathy, the utter disregard for human life. It wasn't about rage or passion. It was pure pleasure in control and destruction. A flesh and blood monster, hiding behind the face of an ordinary man. And even today, despite his life sentence, investigators believe we'll never know the true number of Gary Ridgway's victims. Some women vanished forever, with no trace, no hope of recovery. And every one of those untold stories is a painful reminder. While Ridgway was collecting victims, the system was too slow to respond. The official count might stop at 71, but in reality, the true impact of Ridgway's crimes is immeasurable. Between 1982 and 1984, Seattle and King County lived through a real-life nightmare. In just that short period, Gary Ridgway was at the peak of his killing spree, attacking with terrifying frequency. It felt like a new victim appeared every single week, and the police simply couldn't keep up with the Green River Killer. The city, once peaceful, sank into a climate of fear and mistrust. The streets were no longer safe, especially not for women. The most mind-blowing part is how Ridgway managed to keep up his facade of normalcy during all that time. While committing serial murders, he continued working, attending church services, and taking care of his son. Not a single neighbor, co-worker, no one ever suspected a thing. This ability to compartmentalize life so perfectly is a classic trait of psychopaths who can completely separate their crimes from their everyday existence. Gary was a master at this macabre game. During these years of intense activity, Ridgway kept refining his tactics for luring victims and hiding their bodies. He knew exactly where to operate without being seen and how to get rid of evidence to throw off criminal investigations. Even with a few mistakes here and there, he always seemed one step ahead of the authorities. And back then, the lack of advanced technology, like forensic DNA testing, which wouldn't become powerful until years later, definitely worked in his favor. It was a true blind hunt. And what's even more curious is that even after the number of murders dropped off after 1984, the police were slow to realize the pattern had shifted. Gary Ridgway didn't stop. He just slowed down. The fear still hung heavy in the air, and sporadic disappearances kept authorities on edge. It was like the monster was still lurking, just waiting for the right moment to strike again. And truth be told, he was, only now he was even more careful, colder, and more dangerous. What's probably the most infuriating about this whole case is how long Gary Ridgway stayed free, nearly 20 years between his first murders and his final arrest in 2001. During all that time, the Green River Killer lived life as if nothing had ever happened, while dozens of families were left suffering, desperate for answers. It's surreal to think that for so long, the truth was so close, and yet still completely out of reach for investigators. Part of the delay in catching Ridgway can be blamed on the technological limitations of the era. In the early 1980s, forensic DNA was just a distant dream, and polygraph tests, which Gary passed with ease, were considered the gold standard for detecting lies. With only rudimentary tools and no concrete evidence, the Seattle and King County police were fighting an invisible enemy. It was a brutal waiting game. And sadly, it was the victims who paid the price. Meanwhile, Ridgway kept getting better. Each new victim taught him something: how to hide a body more effectively, how to leave fewer traces, how to act even colder and more detached. The disappearances continued, but his mistakes became harder and harder to spot. With every unsolved crime in the US, the killer's confidence grew. It was as if he truly believed he would never be caught, and for a long time it looked like he might have been right. But time has a funny way of catching up. When forensic DNA technology finally took off in the late 90s and early 2000s, Detectives were able to revisit old evidence, and that's when the tiny traces Gary had left behind became his downfall. A drop of semen, a strand of hair, silent witnesses that had survived the passage of time, and nearly 2 decades later, screamed the truth to the world. The Green River Killer had finally been identified and put behind bars. Now, after diving deep into the disturbing story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, one question still lingers. How many other ordinary faces out there might be hiding similar horrors? If this case teaches us anything, it's that evil doesn't always scream. It whispers, it disguises itself, it hides behind a mask of normalcy. That's why it's so important to stay alert, to question, to pay attention to the signs human behavior can reveal. Are we truly ready to see beyond appearances? How can we in our own lives develop a sharper, more critical eye without losing our empathy? Stories like Gary Ridgway's challenge us to rethink security, justice, and most importantly, the importance of giving a voice to those who are often silenced. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it and use that knowledge to build a more aware, more compassionate future. So what did you think about this journey into the darkest corners of human nature? Do you think we can take what we've learned and actually apply it to our everyday lives? Reflecting on these things is the first step toward growing, both individually and as a society. If you enjoyed this content and want to dive even deeper into real-life stories that shock the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming episodes we've got in store. I'll see you in the next video.